Summer, 1599. Inside the dim chambers of Graz Palace, a young Habsburg princess convulsed violently, her breath breaking, her fingers clawing at the sheets as if to hold on to life itself. Hours later, she was dead. 23 years old, unmarried, untraveled. Official records called it illness. But was it truly disease? Or a killing disguised in plain sight? In this video, we follow the trail of whispers and shadows to uncover the truth. She was born into a world of marble corridors and whispered alliances. On January 4th, 1576, in Graz, the political and spiritual heart of Inner Austria, Princess Catherine Renata of Austria entered life not simply as a child, but as a living thread between two of Europe's most powerful houses, the Habsburgs and the Wittelsbachs of Bavaria. Her father, Archduke Charles II, ruled this southeastern arm of the sprawling Habsburg dominion. Her mother, Princess Maria Anna of Bavaria, was the daughter of a strict and deeply devout court, bringing with her not just a dowry, but a formidable sense of Catholic discipline. From the first moment, Catherine's life was defined by duty. She was not simply a daughter. She was a daughter of two thrones, a bridge meant to reinforce dynastic strength. The walls of Graz Palace were heavy with that expectation. Walls painted with saints, floors echoing with the measured steps of courtiers who knew every movement might be reported. Even as an infant in her gilded cradle, she was part of a political map, a potential bride for a cousin in Spain, a Bavarian prince, or perhaps even a foreign king seeking Habsburg alliance. The palace itself was as much a character in her upbringing as her parents. It was grand, yes, but it was also a place of cold order. Its gardens were clipped to geometric precision, its chapels heavy with incense and candle smoke, its halls hung with portraits of stern ancestors whose eyes seemed to watch the living with silent judgment. For a child, it could be beautiful and stifling. Her father was known for his administrative diligence, but it was her mother who shaped the rhythm of Catherine's days. Maria Anna believed in the power of religious devotion to form moral character. Morning prayers were not optional. Instruction in catechism began almost as soon as Catherine could speak. Meals were formal affairs, even in the nursery. Play was permitted, but always within limits, always under watchful eyes. By Habsburg standards, Catherine's early years were stable. No wars raged at Graz's doorstep. No rebellions shook the family's control. But stability did not mean freedom. A Habsburg princess was a public figure from birth, even when she was never seen beyond the palace gates. Every gesture, every lesson, every stitch of her embroidery was part of an unspoken curriculum. How to embody dignity, how to represent an empire, how to stand perfectly still when the eyes of the court were upon you. And the eyes were always upon her. In portraits, she appears serene, her dark hair neatly arranged beneath a jeweled headpiece, her gown heavy with embroidery, her small hands clasped just so. But what portraits never show is the weight behind the image. Even as a child, she would have known that her behavior reflected not only on herself, but on her family's reputation. A misstep could ripple outward, becoming a matter of diplomatic conversation in Vienna, Madrid, or Rome. As the youngest daughter in a brood that included future empresses and archduchesses married into Europe's most powerful courts, Catherine's role was, on paper, clear. She would marry strategically, extend the influence of her house, and bear heirs to secure alliances. The fact that she was a minor Habsburg princess did not lessen the scrutiny. If anything, it made her value as a political chess piece more acute. Her marriage could be shaped with fewer competing claims than those of a direct heir. But even in her earliest years, there were hints, subtle, easy to dismiss, that her life might not follow the path laid out for her. Palace midwives noted that she tired easily, that she sometimes trembled without obvious cause. These were small details, the kind of observations that in the 16th century were often attributed to delicate temperament or nervous disposition. Yet in a family so tightly bound by blood, where generations of intermarriage had already sown hidden frailties, such signs might have been warnings. Still, in those first years, no one spoke of illness in front of her. Illness was weakness, and weakness was dangerous. Instead, Catherine was presented to visiting dignitaries as healthy, modest, and well-schooled. She took her place beside her sisters at religious ceremonies, her gaze lowered in pious deference. She learned the languages of diplomacy, formal German for the court, Latin for the church, Italian for certain foreign visitors. She embroidered altar cloths for the cathedral, memorized the lives of the saints, and practiced the delicate balance of smiling, just enough to seem warm, but never so much as to appear frivolous. She grew up in the shadow of women who embodied the Habsburg ideal. Sisters who would go on to marry into the courts of Tuscany, Bavaria, and Poland. Aunts and cousins who wore crowns and carried scepters. Catherine's own destiny, at least in the eyes of her family, was to join their ranks. Not as a ruler in her own right, but as a consort whose presence and progeny would tie two powers together. No one imagined, no one wanted to imagine, that she would instead become a figure defined not by alliances or children, but by absence. Looking back, her childhood in Graz seems like a long, slow preparation for a role she would never play. The marble corridors, the curtained windows, the daily rituals of faith and formality, all were meant to prepare her for the wider stage of European politics. Yet in a twist both intimate and tragic, those same walls would one day become the limits of her world. In the glittering but rigid world of late 16th century Habsburg Austria, Catherine Renata's life began with every advantage that rank could provide. A powerful lineage, a secure place in the family hierarchy, a network of potential suitors that stretched across Europe. But the same forces that promised her a future would also, in time, conspire to contain her. And though no one could have known it then, the path from cradle to coffin would never leave Graz. The palace that was supposed to launch her into the world would instead become the place where her story began and ended. By the time Catherine Renata reached her teenage years, the palace had begun to measure her life not in seasons or celebrations, but in the quiet, relentless rhythm of her symptoms. What had once been dismissed as delicate temperament now returned in patterns too persistent to ignore. It began with tremors, small at first, like a shiver on a cool morning. Her hand might shake as she lifted a cup, or a needle might slip in her embroidery. At times, she would pause mid-sentence, her gaze unfocused, as though listening to a sound no one else could hear. Within moments, she would recover, smoothing her skirts and continuing as if nothing had happened. But those who served her daily, her chambermaids, her governess, knew these were not mere lapses in attention. The tremors were followed by something more alarming. Episodes where she would lose consciousness without warning. One moment standing at the chapel altar, the next crumpled to the cold marble floor, her veil slipping from her hair. When she woke, her breathing was ragged, her limbs heavy as though weighted by stone. For hours afterward, she would remain pale and exhausted, unable to rise from her bed. The royal physicians were summoned, their velvet sleeves brushing against gilded bedposts as they leaned over her. They took her pulse, peered into her eyes, pressed cool hands against her temples. But medicine in the late 16th century was less a science than an art of conjecture. Treatments ranged from herbal tonics to whispered prayers. Sometimes they prescribed rest in darkened rooms. Other times, pilgrimages to local shrines. One suggested the wearing of a blessed relic on a ribbon about her neck. Another recommended bleeding to release the excess humors believed to cause her malady. None of it worked. In the eyes of the court, illness was an inconvenience. But in the eyes of her family, it was a liability. Royal daughters were prized for the alliances their marriages could seal. Yet no court in Europe wanted a bride who might collapse during a procession or fail to produce heirs. Catherine began to notice the subtle shifts. The way her name was no longer mentioned when foreign ambassadors visited. The way her mother spoke of her elder sister's betrothals but left hers unaddressed. At feast days, she might be excused from the high table to rest, while the others danced beneath chandeliers. By the time she turned 15, the path her sisters had followed, marriage into foreign courts, carriages rolling out through palace gates, had closed for her. Each year, another sister departed, draped in bridal finery, leaving Catherine behind in rooms that seemed to grow larger and emptier. Her world contracted to the palace grounds, the private chapel, the inner gardens, the long galleries where her footsteps echoed back at her. She found small refuges, her embroidery frame, the faint strains of music from the cathedral choir, the company of a few trusted attendants who did not recoil when her hands shook. She learned to anticipate the seizures, to recognize the strange hum in her ears, the flicker of light at the edge of her vision that signaled another was coming. The attacks left their mark, bruises from falls, a persistent soreness in her jaw from clenched teeth. She began wearing looser gowns, preferring comfort over courtly fashion. Sometimes, in the privacy of her chambers, she wept, not only from pain, but from the knowledge that her life was narrowing into something she had never imagined. The court doctors kept notes, though not always in ways we would recognize today. Their ledgers recorded her condition in vague phrases. Her Highness was overcome by a great weakness. The princess suffered a trembling of the limbs. Her color faded after the evening prayers. No official diagnosis was ever written. Illness in a royale was not to be named. It was to be managed quietly, hidden where possible. And so Catherine's life became a careful balancing act between visibility and concealment. She was still brought out for certain ceremonies, Christmas Mass, the feast of a patron saint. But these appearances were brief, choreographed to avoid the strain that might trigger an episode. She would sit very still, hands folded, lips moving silently in prayer, while her body fought to stay calm. The palace gossip never died entirely. Servants whispered about the attacks, embellishing details, imagining curses or divine omens. Some said the princess had been too holy for the world, and the devil sought to claim her. Others suggested she was paying for some secret family sin. Such talk was dangerous, but in a court where religion framed every event, illness was never just physical. It was spiritual, moral, political. Outside Graz, her name rarely crossed the lips of foreign envoys. Marriage proposals that might have been sent were never written. The young princess was fading from the map of Europe's dynastic future. In her quieter hours, Catherine filled her time with the few pursuits still open to her. She embroidered scenes from the Gospels, stitched with such precision that the figures seemed to breathe in the candlelight. She listened to traveling musicians play lutes and viols in the great hall, closing her eyes as if to let the music fill the spaces her life no longer could. But even in these moments, the shadow of her illness lingered. At any time, during a hymn in the middle of a stitch, the tremor could return, and the world would tilt, pulling her into darkness once more. Her life was not measured in adventures or journeys. in titles won or treaties signed. It was measured in the distance between attacks, in the number of days she could rise without falling. Each passing year seemed to offer less of the world beyond Graz, and more of the same walls, the same cautious footsteps, the same quiet battles between her body and her will. And in a family where strength was currency, Catherine Renata's weakening health was a debt no alliance would pay. Life inside the Graz court was orderly, precise, and suffocating. For Catherine Renata, the palace had become less a home and more a gilded cage, its marble walls and painted ceilings pressing in on her like the slow tightening of a vice. Outside, the city bustled with merchants and festivals, the ringing of church bells marking the hours. Inside, every moment was dictated by ritual. The Habsburg court of the late 16th century was a place where protocol outweighed comfort, where ceremony ruled over spontaneity. Each morning began with prayers, not just in the chapel but in the privacy of her rooms, under her mother's watchful eye or that of a lady in waiting. Breakfast was plain: bread, broth, and watered wine, served in silence unless a visiting dignitary happened to be present. Even in the most mundane moments, posture mattered. Words were measured, expressions controlled. Catherine knew the rules by heart: how to stand at court audiences, when to lower her gaze before clergy, which fork to use at a feast. But knowing the rules and loving them were different things. The rhythm of palace life offered little space for her to breathe, especially as her illness isolated her further. She was rarely invited to the grand hunts that once filled the autumn season with excitement. Winter balls carried on without her. The laughter and music of late-night banquets echoed down the corridors, reaching her only as a muffled reminder of a world she no longer inhabited. Still, she sought small joys where she could find them. In the embroidery room, with sunlight filtering through narrow windows, she worked delicate patterns in silk thread, scenes of gardens she could not walk in, saints she prayed might intercede for her health. In the evenings, she listened to the chapel choir rehearse, their voices drifting through the stone like ghostly companions. She kept a small lapdog in her chambers, one of the few creatures permitted to follow her without ceremony or approval. But even these comforts were under watch. Every servant who attended her reported, directly or indirectly, to her mother or the court physicians. Privacy was almost non-existent. Letters sent to friends or distant relatives were often read before being sealed. Visitors were screened for political importance or propriety. When a Bavarian cousin passed through Graz, Catherine was allowed to see her, but only under the presence of her mother and 2 court officials, their faces set in stone. The court's strict adherence to formality wasn't just about tradition, it was about control. The Habsburgs understood that appearances were power. A princess who faltered in public could ripple uncertainty through the entire network of alliances the family had built. Catherine's illness, therefore, was not merely a personal matter. It was a political inconvenience. The safest solution was to keep her out of sight. The decision to withdraw her from public life came not in a dramatic decree, but in quiet, calculated steps. First, she was excused from long church processions, then from the annual Epiphany feast. Her seat at the high table during Easter was moved to a discreet corner. Eventually, she was absent from most public ceremonies altogether, replaced in visibility by her healthier sisters. Her world narrowed to a few trusted companions, a governess from her childhood, now more a confidant, 2 ladies-in-waiting who had served her faithfully for years, and the palace chaplain, who visited to pray with her and hear her confessions. These relationships were gentle, but they also reinforced her separation from the wider court. They were the walls within the walls. Beyond these inner circles, whispers persisted, In the candlelit corners of the great hall, servants speculated about her health, some with pity, others with superstition. In an era when illness was often seen as divine punishment, her seizures became fertile ground for rumor. Was it a curse? A sign of possession? A warning from God? None of these rumors were spoken aloud in her presence, but Catherine felt them in the cool politeness of certain courtiers, in the way conversations stopped when she entered a room. She carried herself with grace, but she could not ignore the truth. The court was a stage, and she was no longer part of the performance. She told herself she did not mind, that the peace of her private apartments was preferable to the stifling scrutiny of public life. But there were moments, brief, piercing, when she longed to walk unescorted through the city streets, to hear the market criers, to stand in the cathedral without a wall of attendants around her. She longed, in short, to be more than a symbol hidden away for convenience. Yet in Graz, longing was as dangerous as rebellion. And rebellion was something the Habsburgs could not abide. By the late 1590s, Catherine Renata's absence from public life was no longer an occasional necessity. It had become the rule. The palace's great feasts and diplomatic receptions continued without her, their candlelit splendor and whispered negotiations drifting only faintly to the quiet quarters where she now spent nearly all her days. What had begun as careful management of her health turned into something deeper, more deliberate, an unspoken policy of isolation. The Graz residence, once a vast stage for her family's political theater, had narrowed into a series of connected chambers that she rarely left. Her bedchamber, the small oratory, a sitting room with embroidered cushions worn thin from use. These became her entire world. Marble floors gleamed underfoot, frescoed ceilings soared above her head. But grandeur without freedom was no comfort. The echo of her footsteps along empty corridors only deepened the stillness. In an age when appearances dictated alliances, sickness in a royal body was dangerous currency. A persistent rumor about a princess's frailty could unsettle marriage negotiations, weaken diplomatic leverage, and invite speculation about the strength of the dynasty itself. The Habsburgs, like many royal houses, preferred to keep such vulnerabilities hidden. To the outside world, Catherine was indisposed or at rest. In truth, she had been removed from the chessboard altogether. Her absence was explained in polite euphemisms. She was devoting herself to prayer, or assisting with household piety, or engaged in private study. But the reality was that her days were increasingly void of the ceremonial duties expected of a princess. No more public audiences, no more processions. Even family gatherings were adjusted to accommodate her condition, with seating arranged so that she might slip away unnoticed if a seizure struck. The isolation was physical, but it was also informational. Letters from abroad were screened before reaching her. News of court politics, of the wider Habsburg realm, came in careful fragments, often sanitized, as if to protect her from agitation. Visitors were rare, and when they came, they were always escorted, their conversations monitored by a senior lady-in-waiting or a court chaplain. For Catherine, this separation from the outer life of the court carried a subtle humiliation. Her sisters wrote from foreign palaces about their children, their hunts, their voyages along rivers she would never see. These letters, though warmly phrased, were reminders of the life she had been denied. She replied with polite interest, filling her pages with descriptions of the gardens, her embroidery projects, her readings of the saints' lives, carefully omitting the reality that most days passed in a haze of fatigue, interrupted only by the fear of the next seizure. The few who knew her best tried to soften the edges of her confinement. Her governess-turned companion read to her from devotional works and romances. sometimes slipping in a tale of distant lands or heroic deeds to lift her spirits. The palace organist would occasionally play in the chapel below her rooms, the music rising through the stone like a reminder that beauty still existed beyond the walls. Yet even these kindnesses could not disguise the truth. She was no longer part of the living fabric of court life. Outside her secluded quarters, the world moved on. The court busied itself with diplomatic marriages, military campaigns, and the careful balancing act of Habsburg politics. In the public eye, Catherine's name barely surfaced, an omission that was both deliberate and effective. She was becoming a silent chapter in the family's history, a figure to be remembered in footnotes rather than painted portraits. Within the walls of Graz, her isolation carried an almost monastic quality. Days were marked by the ringing of the palace bells, morning prayers, midday meals, evening vespers. Between these, she sat near the tall, narrow windows, gazing out over the courtyards. She could watch the changing of the guards, the servants hurrying with baskets, the occasional carriage arriving with some new dignitary. Always from a distance, always from behind glass and stone. Her illness was the reason given for this withdrawal. But Catherine must have understood the other reason, the one no one spoke aloud. A healthy princess could be shown off like a jewel, her presence reinforcing the dynasty's image of vitality and divine favor. A sick princess, however innocent and devout, risked sending the opposite message. In this way, her marble prison served two purposes. It protected her from the strain of public life, and it protected the family from the strain of her presence. The first might have been born of compassion. The second was born of politics. And so, while the Habsburg court outwardly thrived, one of its daughters faded quietly behind closed doors. Her life measured in the shifting light of the sun through high windows and the muted toll of bells marking hours that all felt the same. What she could not yet know was that this isolation was not the worst her illness would bring. The seizures were growing stronger. The walls that kept her hidden would soon become the walls where she fought for her final breaths. By the final years of the 1590s, Catherine Renata's illness had transformed from an unwelcome intruder into an unrelenting master. What had once been occasional, frightening episodes now came with grim regularity. The tremors she could once hide beneath the folds of her gown grew into full seizures, violent convulsions that left her attendants frozen between the instinct to hold her down and the fear of doing harm. The attacks often began with a warning she could feel but not stop, a tightening in her chest, a strange hum in her ears, the sensation that the light in the room had shifted. Sometimes she would grip the edge of a chair, willing herself to stay upright. Other times, she would only manage to mutter a prayer before her body betrayed her completely. Muscles seized, her jaw locked, and she would collapse onto the cold marble floor or the embroidered cushions of her bed. Minutes stretched into eternities. Her limbs jerked with a force that left bruises. Her face blanched, lips tinged with blue, eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. The sound of her breathing, ragged, uneven, would send attendants rushing for the court physician and the chaplain. When the seizure passed, she often lay still for long moments, her body slack, as though she had left the world entirely. The recovery was no less cruel. She would wake drenched in sweat, her hair clinging to her temples, her nightgown twisted and damp. Every muscle ached. Her tongue was sometimes bitten through, leaving the metallic tang of blood in her mouth. Speech came slowly. Movements were weak and clumsy. On the worst days, she could not stand without assistance, her legs trembling as though they no longer belonged to her. For the physicians, there was little to do beyond the familiar rituals of early modern medicine. They prescribed herbal infusions, fumigations of rosemary and frankincense, and the ever-present recourse to prayer. Leeching was attempted, believed to balance the humors, but it left her more anemic than before. Holy water was sprinkled on her brow. Relics of saints were placed beneath her pillow. Each treatment was followed by the same crushing disappointment. Nothing worked. The chaplain, a man who had known her since childhood, visited almost daily. He spoke to her of endurance, of the saints who had suffered in silence, of the heavenly reward that awaited the faithful. Catherine listened politely, but in private. To her most trusted lady-in-waiting, she confessed the truth. She did not fear death so much as she feared the waiting. The days between seizures were now spent in the shadow of the next one. As her condition worsened, her physical world shrank further. She no longer walked the palace galleries. The risk of collapsing in view of others was too great. Meals were brought to her rooms and often left untouched, her appetite eroded by fatigue and nausea. She took to sitting by the window for hours, her embroidery frame forgotten on her lap, staring at the changing light as though measuring time by the slow drift of shadows across the courtyard. The court grew accustomed to her absence. In public records, her name appeared only in lists of those present at rare family gatherings. In private correspondence, she was described as delicate or withdrawn. Few outside her immediate household knew how far she had declined. Yet among those who did, a quiet vigilance took hold. The two ladies-in-waiting who served her most closely began sleeping in an adjoining room, ready to rush in at the first sound of a fall or a cry. The palace physician insisted on keeping a chair by her bed during the night. And the chaplain, sensing that his presence calmed her in the moments before unconsciousness claimed her, often lingered until she drifted into uneasy sleep. There were rare reprieves, days when she seemed almost herself again. On such mornings, she might ask to hear the organist play in the chapel, or request her lapdog be brought to her bed. But these interludes never lasted. The seizures returned without mercy, sometimes twice in a single day. Each one left her weaker, slower to recover, more reluctant to hope. It was in these years that Catherine must have realized there would be no escape. Not through marriage, not through pilgrimage, not even through the whispered promises of miraculous cures. Her body had turned against her, and no rank or prayer could reverse the sentence it had passed. The marble walls that had once separated her from the dangers of the outside world now enclosed her in a private battlefield, one where the enemy was not an army or a court faction, but the relentless, unseen storms within her own flesh. And as the summer of 1599 approached, those storms would gather for the final time. The summer of 1599 settled over Graz with a heavy, airless heat. Inside the palace, the thick stone walls trapped the warmth, turning corridors into breathless passages where candles wavered in the stillness. Catherine Renata had endured worse summers before, but this one began differently. The fatigue came earlier in the day. Her steps, already measured, slowed to a near shuffle. She slept longer, spoke less, and seemed at times to drift away mid-conversation, as if her mind was already stepping into some place beyond reach. Her attendants noticed the change, though they tried not to name it. The court physician visited more often, his leather satchel always close at hand. The chaplain lingered after prayers, his gaze holding a depth of worry he did not put into words. The women who dressed and fed her worked in hushed coordination, as though any sudden noise might hasten what they feared was coming. It was in early July that the first of the new seizures struck, longer, harsher, more unforgiving than the ones before. Catherine collapsed in her chamber, her body drawn into a rigid arch, her hands clawing at the bedclothes. The convulsions shook her so violently that the wooden bed frame groaned under the strain. When it was over, she lay limp, her breathing shallow and erratic, her eyes half open but unseeing. She did not speak again until the following evening, and then only in a whisper. From that day forward, she seemed to exist in the thin space between waking and oblivion. Some days, she took a few spoonfuls of broth. Other days, she refused even water. The skin along her jawline sharpened. Her wrists were narrow enough that a lady in waiting could encircle them with thumb and forefinger. She kept to her bed almost entirely, the outside world reduced to the square of sky visible from her high window. The final seizure came without warning in the oppressive heat of an afternoon. She had been resting, propped on pillows, a rosary slipping loosely through her fingers as the chaplain murmured a litany beside her. Her breathing, though shallow, had been steady. Then, without a sound, her body stiffened. The rosary fell from her grasp. Her head jerked back, mouth opening in a gasp that never found full breath. Her eyes rolled upward, lids fluttering against the strain. The convulsions began, not in the small tremors her attendants had seen before, but in a full, merciless wave that shook her from head to foot. The muscles of her neck strained against the ties of her linen cap. Her fingers curled in on themselves until the nails bit into her palms. The ladies in waiting moved quickly, one pressing a folded cloth between her teeth to keep her from biting through her tongue, another holding her shoulders to keep her from striking the bed frame. The chaplain pressed the small silver crucifix to her chest, whispering words of absolution even as his voice broke. Minutes passed, long, punishing minutes, before the seizure began to ebb. Her body fell back against the damp pillows, every line of her frame slackened. But the relief was illusory. Her breath came in rapid, shallow bursts. Her skin, slick with sweat, had taken on a grayish pallor. The physician, summoned too late to stop the attack, felt for a pulse and frowned. He ordered cool cloths for her brow, murmured instructions for tinctures no one truly believed would help. The room grew very quiet. The only sounds were the labored rasp of her breathing and the faint creak of floorboards as attendants moved about. Catherine's gaze wandered, unfocused, her lips forming silent words no one could hear. For a moment her eyes seemed to clear, fixing on the chaplain's face. She tried to speak. He bent low to listen. "We are almost there," she breathed. Whether she meant the end of the seizure, the end of her suffering, or something beyond any of them could see, no one knew. Her breathing slowed. The pauses between each inhalation grew longer. One final exhale left her lips in a faint sigh. Then, stillness. She was 23 years old. She had never married, never left the walls of her birthplace, never worn the crown or veils prepared for her betrothal portrait years before. Her passing was not marked by the toll of cathedral bells, nor by the stately procession that carried other Habsburg dead to their tombs. Only a handful of attendants and a single priest stood witness as the physician closed her eyes. Outside, the summer heat pressed on. In the city below, life went on. Merchants called their wares, children played in the dust, and the people of Graz remained unaware that a princess had just slipped quietly from their midst. And within the marble walls that had contained her entire life, Catherine Renata of Austria lay still at last, her struggle over, her story already receding into the silence from which it would take centuries to emerge. In the days following Catherine Renata's death, the corridors of Graz Palace remained eerily calm. There was no sudden flurry of preparation for a state funeral. No black drapery hung from the windows. No proclamations read aloud to the people in the square. Her passing was treated as a private matter. almost as if it were a family inconvenience rather than the death of a Habsburg princess. An official statement was drafted, brief and bloodless. Her Highness the Archduchess Catherine Renata has departed this life after a period of illness. We commend her soul to God's mercy. It was read to a small circle of courtiers and clergy, then quietly copied into the family records. No public mourning was declared. For a princess of her rank, this was unusual, but it was also deliberate. Catherine had been out of public view for so long that her absence had already been absorbed into the rhythm of court life. There was no political advantage in drawing attention to her death, no alliance to honor, no foreign court to appease. The same discretion that had kept her illness a private affair now ensured her passing would leave barely a ripple. Her burial was swift. In the dim light of early morning, a wooden coffin was carried from her chambers to the family crypt in the mausoleum attached to Graz Cathedral. The ceremony was short, attended only by immediate family, a handful of senior courtiers, and the clergy. Latin prayers echoed off cold stone walls as incense drifted toward the vaulted ceiling. There were no musicians, no procession through the city, no foreign envoys in attendance. When the final blessing was given, the coffin was lowered into its resting place without fanfare. Her name was inscribed in the Habsburg genealogies, a single line among dozens, noting her birth and death dates. There were no epithets, no words of praise. In portraits, galleries across the empire, there was no official likeness of her to hang. Only a few sketches, never intended for public display, remained in private collections, capturing her in profile, her features calm and unremarkable to an untrained eye. Within the family, she was remembered in muted tones. Her surviving siblings spoke of her as gentle, pious, and dutiful. Words that, while kind, stripped away any complexity from her life. She was a daughter who had caused no scandal, a sister who had not interfered in politics, a figure whose quiet existence left no dangerous echoes. It was a memory both safe and incomplete. Among the servants who had cared for her, the recollections were warmer, tinged with the intimacy of those who had witnessed her daily struggles. They remembered the way she would hum softly when embroidering, the care she took in feeding her lapdog scraps from her own plate, the way her face lit up when music from the chapel reached her rooms. But even these memories were rarely shared beyond trusted company. The hierarchy of the court discouraged talk of a princess's vulnerabilities. Outside the palace, her name faded quickly. There were no poets to immortalize her, no chroniclers to weave her into the grand narrative of the Habsburg dynasty. While other members of the family were celebrated for marriages, victories, or patronage of the arts, Catherine Renata's legacy was absence. In the eyes of history, she had done nothing remarkable, not because she lacked character, but because her life had been hemmed in so tightly by illness and circumstance. Yet in that absence lies a different kind of significance. Catherine's story, if pieced together from the scraps left behind, speaks to the quiet lives erased by the machinery of dynastic politics. Her worth, in the eyes of her contemporaries, was measured entirely by her potential as a political asset. When illness removed that potential, she became an afterthought, her existence politely acknowledged but kept out of sight. She was not remembered in monuments or marble effigies, but in the fading recollection of a few loyal attendants, in the brief entries of cathedral death registers, in the faint ink of family trees copied by court scribes. And for centuries, that was all the world knew. But perhaps silence itself is a kind of memorial, one that tells its own truth. The absence of ceremony, the lack of public grief, the deliberate erasure from political memory, these are all part of her story. They reveal as much about the values of her time as any grand eulogy could. In a dynasty obsessed with strength, the weak were not mourned in the open. They were buried quietly, their lives folded away like letters never meant to be read. And so Catherine Renata of Austria, daughter of two thrones, became another shadow in the long corridors of Habsburg history. Remembered when she was remembered at all, in silence. From the perspective of modern medicine, the death of Princess Catherine Renata of Austria at only 23 reads less like a mystery and more like a tragic inevitability, one written into her body long before she drew her first breath. Today, we can give names to conditions her physicians could only describe in vague, pious terms. We can see patterns in the Habsburg family tree that her contemporaries either ignored or considered a necessary price for maintaining dynastic purity. The Habsburgs were not unique in marrying within their own bloodline, but few dynasties practiced it with such persistence. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces, all in the name of political unity. Over generations, this strategy tightened the genetic circle until the risks became impossible to ignore. Physical deformities like the infamous Habsburg jaw, mandibular prognathism, became common. Less visible, but far more dangerous, were the hidden genetic disorders that could damage the nervous system, disrupt brain function, and shorten lives. Catherine's parents, Archduke Charles II and Princess Maria Anna of Bavaria, were not only first cousins, but part of a web of repeated intermarriages connecting Austria, Spain, and Bavaria. Modern genealogists have calculated the coefficient of inbreeding for certain members of the dynasty as alarmingly high, meaning that rare genetic mutations had a greater chance of being passed down and expressed. In Catherine's case, this may have translated into a neurological condition like severe epilepsy, possibly worsened by other inherited weaknesses. Accounts from her attendants describe sudden loss of consciousness, convulsions, post-seizure confusion, and prolonged fatigue, all classic features of seizure disorders. But the physicians of her day had no concept of epilepsy as we understand it. In 16th century Austria, such episodes might be attributed to vapors, melancholia, or even demonic influence. The remedies, bleeding, purges, herbal tonics, the application of relics, were not only ineffective but potentially harmful. If she had been born today, Catherine would have had access to anticonvulsant medications, brain imaging, and dietary therapies that might have allowed her to live decades longer. Her seizures could have been managed. Her life, while still shaped by illness, would not have been reduced to confinement and slow decline. But in her own time, there was no framework for understanding her condition outside of moral or spiritual interpretation. Even if her illness had been recognized as a purely physical problem, there was another obstacle: politics. In the Habsburg worldview, a royal body was not just personal, it was a symbol of the dynasty's strength. Admitting that a princess was chronically ill, especially in a way that might be hereditary, risked undermining marriage negotiations and diplomatic alliances. Illness was therefore concealed whenever possible, explained away as temporary indisposition, and quietly managed out of sight. Catherine's life became a case study in this kind of concealment. Her withdrawal from public events, her increasingly restricted movements, the lack of any formal portrait in adulthood, all were part of a pattern designed to preserve the family's image. In effect, her illness was treated not just as a medical matter, but as classified information. From a modern vantage point, the cruelty of this approach is clear. By hiding her condition, the court denied her the possibility of broader sympathy, potential medical attention from outside experts, or even the small dignity of being known for who she was, rather than what she could no longer do. It also denied the dynasty an opportunity to confront the long-term consequences of its own inbreeding practices. Historians and geneticists today look back at the Habsburgs not just as political rulers, but as a living experiment in the dangers of closed bloodlines. Catherine's death, alongside the early deaths of other relatives, forms part of a pattern that would culminate in later, more famous cases, such as Charles II of Spain, whose body and mind were so ravaged by genetic disorders that he became a byword for dynastic decline. Yet Catherine's case is perhaps more poignant precisely because she was not a queen or a ruling monarch. She had no political scandals, no wars tied to her name. Her tragedy is quiet, almost invisible. An unfulfilled life ended by an inherited flaw she could neither control nor escape. It is the kind of history that slips easily between the cracks, preserved only in the notes of physicians, the guarded letters of family members, and the official genealogies where her name is reduced to 2 dates. In the end, her story carries a warning that transcends her own century. That no lineage, however grand, can insulate itself from the consequences of ignoring human fragility. The Habsburgs built empires on the idea that bloodline was destiny. For Catherine Renata, that proved true, but not in the way her ancestors intended. Her destiny was written not in the gold of a marriage contract, but in the silent code of her DNA. In the rigid architecture of royal life, a princess's worth was often measured in the alliances she could forge through marriage. Catherine Renata's value, at least in the eyes of her dynasty, was meant to be transactional. A union with another noble house, a treaty sealed in bloodlines. When her health failed, that function dissolved. Without a betrothal, without even a formal courtship in her adult years, she became an anomaly, a royal daughter who would never leave the palace to become someone else's queen. In her world, this was not a neutral state. To remain unmarried was to stand outside the central narrative of dynastic womanhood. Marriage was the axis upon which a princess's life turned. It was her entrance into political relevance, her opportunity to shape the future of kingdoms. Without it, she became, in effect, a private figure in a public institution, an ornament placed on a high shelf and quietly forgotten. Catherine's unmarried status shaped every perception of her within the court. She was not given the elaborate wardrobe befitting a bride-to-be. Her public appearances dwindled until even in Graz, where she had lived her entire life, she was seen rarely enough to become a figure of rumor. Some may have whispered that she was too delicate, others that she had chosen a pious seclusion. The truth, that her seizures made long ceremonies dangerous and travel impossible, remained hidden behind the palace's marble walls. For women of her rank, there were few acceptable alternatives to marriage. Some entered convents, where they might wield influence as abbesses or patrons of religious art. Others acted as mediators within their families, moving between courts as trusted emissaries. Catherine had neither path. Her illness denied her the stamina for public life, and her family's silence denied her the clarity of a defined role. She existed in the narrow corridor between visibility and erasure. Her death at 23, unmarried and childless, meant that her name would not live on in future genealogies as the ancestress of princes or queens. There were no grandchildren to recall her, no dynastic branch to bear her coat of arms. Instead, she was reduced to a footnote, a princess whose line ended with herself. In the genealogical charts of the Habsburgs, her life was represented by a single horizontal line, terminating abruptly without the vertical descent of heirs. That absence carried its own quiet tragedy. In a family obsessed with continuity, she became a symbol of interruption, of potential unrealized. The court may have considered her loss minor compared to the death of a reigning monarch or a male heir. But within the fragile web of dynastic politics, every link mattered. Her absence in marriage negotiations meant one less alliance, one less opportunity to bind another territory or noble family to the Habsburg cause. Beyond politics, there is the human scale of her fate. To live in a world where marriage was the only socially recognized route to personal fulfillment, and to be denied it entirely, was to be shut out of the rites that gave life shape. The procession to the altar, the celebration of childbirth, the status of matriarch. We do not know if Catherine mourned this herself, or if illness and seclusion made those milestones seem remote. But the culture around her would have defined her life as incomplete. Her story forces a modern reader to question the frameworks we use to measure worth. Then, as now, there are lives that do not follow the expected script. Lives cut short, altered by illness, shaped by circumstances beyond the individual's control. In Catherine's case, the deviation from the script led not to a new role, but to absence. She left no policy, no memoir, no legend to preserve her voice. What remains is only the outline of a life, with the details lost to the silence of the court. In this way, she becomes a mirror for others history has left behind. Not only the royals with illnesses too scandalous to mention, but also the countless ordinary women whose lives were never recorded because they did not fit the mold their societies demanded. Her fate challenges the notion that history remembers only the extraordinary. Sometimes it forgets those who were simply human, and in doing so loses an essential part of its truth. When I think of Catherine Renata, I do not see her as the fragile princess sealed away in Graz, nor as the silent figure who failed to fulfill her dynastic duty. I see her as a young woman trapped in a role she did not choose, existing in a palace that became both her shelter and her cage. History has recorded her in the language of absence. No crown, no marriage, no heirs, as if what she did not accomplish were all that mattered. But perhaps the truest tragedy is that her presence, her mind, her human experiences were never thought worth preserving. In the grand archives of the Habsburgs, her life is a thin thread, barely visible against the tapestry of emperors and empresses. But that thread matters. It is a reminder that the lives of the forgotten are not less important than the celebrated victories and coronations. It reminds us that power does not erase vulnerability, and that silence, whether imposed or chosen, has its own story to tell. I sometimes imagine her, in her final months, looking out from a balcony over the city she never left. The bells ringing in the distance, the market below alive with voices. The world carrying on without knowing her face or her name. And I wonder if she ever thought of herself as invisible, or if she found, in her quiet existence, a kind of defiance. In a dynasty obsessed with control, perhaps simply enduring was its own act of resistance. Catherine's story is not just a historical curiosity. It is a reflection of how easily a life can be reduced to a line in a ledger. And yet, by speaking her name today, by remembering the details history discarded, we return to her a piece of the dignity she was denied. The past is full of such lives, brief, silenced, and quietly erased. They deserve to be told, not because they changed the course of empires, but because they were human. If you, like me, believe that these lost voices matter, that every hidden life is worth bringing back into the light, then join us. Subscribe to Dark Ages Unveiled. Share this story, because somewhere in the corners of history, another Catherine Renata waits to be found.